You know, last week I was trying to fix my car radio, and after 20 minutes of aggressive button mashing, I finally managed to tune in to what I thought was going to be classic rock. Instead, I got 15 minutes of someone explaining the mating habits of prairie dogs in excruciating detail. And you know what? I didn't change the channel because there's something oddly comforting about accidentally stumbling into educational content when you're expecting mindless entertainment. It's like ordering a burger and getting a salad that somehow tastes amazing. And as I sat there learning more about prairie dog reproduction than I ever thought I needed to know, I realized something profound. When was the last time commercial radio taught me anything useful? When was the last time I accidentally learned something on a corporate-owned station that wasn't about which energy drink would supposedly change my life, or why I desperately needed to refinance my mortgage right now? The answer, honestly, was never. But here's the thing about that prairie dog documentary. It was probably on public radio, which means there's a decent chance that program doesn't exist anymore, because we need to talk about what's happening to public media in America. And spoiler alert, it's not good news for prairie dogs or for any of us, really. Now, when I say public media, I'm talking about the stuff you probably grew up with without even thinking about it. PBS brought you Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street. NPR gave your parents something to listen to during those endless car rides that made them feel intellectually superior to people who listen to morning radio DJs. These are the stations that taught us that television didn't have to be just about selling us things we didn't need with money we didn't have. But according to recent reports, public media is facing what experts are calling an existential crisis, which is a fancy way of saying it's in deep trouble, and not the kind of trouble that can be fixed with a bake sale or a really enthusiastic membership drive featuring an oversized thermometer graphic. Let me give you some context. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or CPB, is basically the financial backbone of public media. Think of it as the concerned uncle who quietly pays everyone's bills and keeps the family functional. For decades, the CPB has distributed federal funding to more than 1,500 locally managed radio and television stations across the country, reaching about 99% of Americans. 99%. That's more coverage than most cell phone companies can manage, and they charge you $70 a month for the privilege. But here's where things get complicated. Over the past few years, public media has been caught in an increasingly vicious cycle of political attacks, budget cuts, and what I can only describe as weaponized nostalgia. Critics, and by critics, I mean primarily conservative politicians looking for easy targets, have spent years arguing that public media represents everything wrong with government spending. Too liberal, too elitist, too expensive, and somehow simultaneously too boring and too dangerous. Now let's talk about the money, because that's usually where these arguments start. The current federal investment in public media amounts to about $1.35 per American per year. $1.35. That's less than what most people spend on a single cup of coffee. And it's definitely less than what I spent on that disappointing gas station sandwich I bought while trying to fix my radio. For comparison, countries like the United Kingdom spend about $38 per person per year on public broadcasting. Norway spends nearly $90. Even Canada, which is famous for being polite about everything, spends significantly more per capita than we do. But let's really put this in perspective. Germany spends over $40 per person annually on public broadcasting. France invests about $28. Even Australia, a country that literally started as a prison colony, somehow figured out that investing in public media was worth approximately $15 per person per year. Meanwhile, we're debating whether $1.35 is too extravagant for a country that spends more on military bands than most nations spend on their entire defense budgets. And here's what really drives me crazy about the cost argument. We're talking about an investment that amounts to less than what the average American spends on ringtones in a year. Yes, ringtones. People are still buying those, apparently, and they're spending more on them annually than their government spends on public media. But the cost argument misses a much bigger point about what public media actually does. These aren't just stations that exist to play jazz music at 3 in the morning or run pledge drives featuring tote bags that nobody actually wants. Local public stations often serve as the primary source of news for communities where commercial media has simply given up. Take rural areas, for instance. According to research from the Pew Research Center, more than 200 counties across the United States have no daily newspaper. 200 counties. That means millions of Americans live in what researchers call news deserts, places where local journalism has essentially disappeared, leaving residents with no reliable way to find out about city council meetings, school board elections, or even basic emergency information. Public radio often fills that gap. In Alaska, for example, public radio stations provide critical information about weather conditions, flight schedules, and emergency services to remote communities that might not have reliable internet access or cell phone coverage. In New Mexico, tribal radio stations broadcast in native languages, preserving cultural traditions while also providing practical information about health services and community events. And then there are moments when public media becomes genuinely essential for public safety. During Hurricane Katrina, when most commercial broadcasters evacuated New Orleans, the local NPR station stayed on the air, providing vital information about evacuation routes, shelter locations, and rescue operations. The station manager later said that they considered leaving, but realized that people were depending on them for life-saving information. That's not entertainment programming, that's infrastructure. But Katrina wasn't an isolated example. During the 2017 California wildfires, public radio stations provided continuous coverage when commercial stations went back to regular programming. In Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria devastated the island's communication infrastructure, the few public radio stations that managed to stay operational became lifelines for isolated communities trying to find family members, locate emergency supplies, and get medical help. And it's not just natural disasters. During the early days of the COVID pandemic, when reliable health information was literally a matter of life and death, local public radio stations became trusted sources for accurate updates about hospital capacity, vaccine availability, and safety protocols. While social media was flooded with conspiracy theories and commercial news-chased ratings with sensational stories, public radio provided the kind of steady, fact-based reporting that communities actually needed. Think about that for a moment. In our most vulnerable moments, when hurricanes are bearing down, when wildfires are spreading, when a global pandemic is unfolding, we depend on the very institutions that politicians want to defund for being too liberal. But here's what makes this whole situation particularly frustrating. The political attacks on public media often focus on alleged liberal bias, as if the real problem with America is that too many people have access to thoughtful journalism and educational programming. Republican politicians regularly propose zeroing out CPB funding, arguing that taxpayer money shouldn't support what they characterize as propaganda. Now, I want to address this bias argument directly because it's worth taking seriously. Yes, studies have shown that NPR's audience skews liberal, and yes, some conservative listeners have raised legitimate concerns about editorial choices. But here's the thing about bias. Every news source has it. The question isn't whether bias exists. It's whether a news organization makes good faith efforts to be accurate, fair, and transparent about their reporting process. And by those standards, public media generally performs pretty well. NPR has a detailed ethics handbook, publishes corrections prominently, and has an ombudsman whose job is literally to criticize NPR when they mess up. Fox News has Tucker Carlson. I'm not saying that's a perfect comparison, but it's worth noting that the standards we apply to public media seem to be significantly higher than what we expect from commercial broadcasters. But let's dig deeper into this bias question, because it reveals something interesting about how we think about journalism. When critics complain that NPR is too liberal, what they're often really saying is that NPR covers stories that make conservative politicians uncomfortable. Climate change, for instance. NPR treats climate science as settled science because it is settled science. But apparently, acknowledging scientific consensus now counts as liberal bias. The same pattern emerges with coverage of voting rights, healthcare policy, and social issues. Public media tends to center the experiences of marginalized communities, fact-check political claims rigorously, and provide context for complex policy debates. In an increasingly polarized environment, that approach can feel threatening to people who prefer their news to confirm their existing beliefs rather than challenge them. More importantly, the bias argument completely ignores what local public media actually does on a daily basis. Local public radio stations aren't sitting around plotting the overthrow of capitalism. They're covering school board meetings, interviewing local business owners, and broadcasting high school football games. The most politically radical thing most of these stations do is remind people to vote, which shouldn't be controversial in a democracy. But even if you accept the premise that public media leans left, and I'm not necessarily conceding that point, defunding it entirely seems like a pretty extreme response. It's like burning down your house because you don't like the color of the kitchen cabinets. Maybe try repainting first. And here's what makes this whole debate even more absurd. The same politicians who complain about public media being too liberal are often the first ones to show up at local public TV studios when they want to reach voters. They'll gladly appear on public television during campaign season, but then turn around and argue that these stations don't deserve to exist. That's not principled opposition. That's opportunistic hypocrisy. Meanwhile, the actual viewers and listeners of public media, the people these stations serve, generally seem pretty happy with what they're getting. According to polling, public media consistently ranks among the most trusted news sources in America. People may disagree about specific stories or editorial choices, but they recognize that public media outlets generally try to get things right. So why are we even having this conversation about defunding public media? Part of it is genuine ideological disagreement about the role of government. Some people believe that if something can be provided by private companies, the government shouldn't be involved. That's a legitimate philosophical position, even if I disagree with it. But I suspect a bigger part of the hostility toward public media has to do with a broader cultural anxiety about authority and expertise. Public media represents a model of journalism that values accuracy over speed, context over conflict, and education over entertainment. In an era when many Americans are deeply suspicious of institutions, experts, and anything that feels elitist, public media becomes an easy target. The irony is that public media is actually one of the most democratic institutions we have. Unlike commercial broadcasters, public stations are required to serve their entire communities, not just the demographics that advertisers want to reach. They're accountable to local boards, federal regulations, and ultimately to the public. That's more accountability than most news organizations can claim. And let's talk about what we actually lose when public media disappears. It's not just a matter of fewer pledge drives interrupting your weekend listening. When local public stations shut down, communities lose local news coverage, educational programming, and cultural programming that commercial broadcasters simply won't provide. In 2020, the Appalachian region lost several public radio stations due to budget cuts. The result wasn't that commercial stations stepped up to fill the gap. Instead, those communities simply had less access to local news, emergency information, and educational content. That's not creative destruction, that's just destruction. Children's programming is particularly vulnerable when public media funding disappears. Commercial television has largely abandoned educational programming for kids because it's much more profitable to sell sugary cereal and plastic toys than it is to teach kids about science or literature. Public television fills that gap with programs like Sesame Street, which has been teaching kids to read, count, and think critically for more than 50 years. Research has consistently shown that children who watch educational public television programs perform better in school and develop stronger social skills. A recent study from the University of Massachusetts found that children who regularly watched PBS programming scored significantly higher on reading comprehension tests and showed improved mathematical reasoning skills compared to kids who primarily consumed commercial children's television. But here's what makes this research even more compelling. The benefits are strongest for children from low-income families. Kids whose parents can't afford private tutoring, educational apps, or expensive learning materials rely on public television for educational content that middle-class families take for granted. PBS programming essentially functions as a free early childhood education system, reaching millions of children who might not otherwise have access to high-quality educational content. And it's not just about academic performance. Shows like Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood teach emotional regulation and social skills. Wild Kratts introduces kids to biology and environmental science. These programs don't just entertain, they actively prepare children for success in school and life. That's not partisan propaganda, that's documented educational impact. But apparently, we've decided that this kind of programming is a luxury we can't afford, even though it costs less per year than what the military spends on fuel in a single day. And here's something that should concern everyone, regardless of their political views. When public media disappears, what replaces it isn't necessarily better journalism or more diverse viewpoints. What replaces it is often nothing at all, or worse, unreliable information from social media and partisan websites. We're living through a crisis of information quality, where many Americans can't distinguish between legitimate journalism and propaganda, between verified facts and conspiracy theories. Public media isn't perfect, but it at least represents a commitment to journalistic standards and editorial independence. When we destroy that, we're not creating more freedom or more choice, we're creating more confusion. Look, I understand the impulse to question whether government should fund media at all. That's a reasonable debate to have. But let's at least be honest about what we're actually debating. We're not talking about whether to fund propaganda or biased reporting. We're talking about whether to fund local journalism, emergency broadcasting, educational programming, and cultural content that serves communities across America. And here's the thing that really gets me about this entire situation. The people who will be most hurt by cuts to public media funding aren't wealthy liberals in major cities. Those people have plenty of media options. The people who get hurt are residents of rural communities, tribal nations, and small towns where public media might be the only reliable source of local news and information. That means the politicians who are working hardest to defund public media are actually working against the interests of their own constituents. They're scoring cheap political points by attacking liberal media, while simultaneously making it harder for their own voters to access reliable information. This isn't about left versus right. This is about whether we value informed communities, educational opportunity, and reliable information. Those shouldn't be partisan issues. So what can we do about this? Well, if you care about public media, the most obvious step is to actually support it. Donate to your local public radio or television station. Volunteer for pledge drives. Attend community events. Show up to public meetings when these stations are discussing their budgets or programming. But individual support, while important, isn't enough to solve this problem. We also need to engage with the political process. Contact your representatives and tell them that public media funding matters to you. Vote in local elections, because school board members and city council representatives often have significant influence over public media policy. Make noise when politicians propose cuts to CPB funding. And here's something that might surprise you. Become a more informed consumer of media in general. Learn to distinguish between journalism that serves communities and journalism that serves advertisers. Support news organizations that invest in local reporting, fact-checking, and accountability journalism. The more we reward quality journalism with our attention and dollars, the more likely we are to get quality journalism. We also need to have honest conversations about media literacy in our communities. Public media isn't perfect, but it generally operates with higher editorial standards than most alternatives. Teaching people to evaluate sources, check facts, and think critically about information isn't partisan activism. It's basic citizenship in a democracy. Because here's what I learned from that accidental prairie dog documentary I heard on the radio. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can stumble across is something you weren't looking for, something that makes you think differently or learn something new. Public media creates space for that kind of accidental discovery. It makes room for programming that might not be immediately profitable, but is ultimately valuable. And you know what else I learned from that prairie dog story? Those little rodents have incredibly complex social structures, sophisticated communication systems, and they've actually developed what scientists call language, different alarm calls for different types of predators. In other words, prairie dogs figured out how to create reliable, accurate communication systems that serve their entire community. Maybe we could learn something from them. In a world that's increasingly dominated by algorithms designed to give us exactly what we expect, maybe we need more opportunities for unexpected discoveries. Maybe we need more prairie dog documentaries. Maybe we need more programming that challenges us instead of just confirming what we already believe. That's what's really at stake here. Not just funding for public media, but the idea that media can serve purposes beyond entertainment and profit. The idea that we can have journalism that's accountable to communities rather than advertisers. The idea that education and culture are worth supporting even when they're not immediately profitable. Those are ideas worth fighting for. Even if it means listening to more documentaries about prairie dogs, especially if it means listening to more documentaries about prairie dogs, because honestly, they turned out to be pretty fascinating. And that's exactly the kind of accidental education we risk losing when we let public media disappear.